Hello and welcome back to the world of Spirit and Shield. As always, my name is John and I will continue to be your guide on this journey. So for those of you joining us for the first time, Spirit and Shield is a brand new fantasy world that we are exploring through short stories. Today we have our second short story. It's called The Harvest. We did have another one 2 weeks ago. If you missed it, I'll go ahead and put the link down below. Go ahead and check it out. It's pretty nice, turned out pretty well. The way this works though is I'm really looking for your involvement in these stories. So if you have any questions, any comments, or if something comes up in a story that you want to explore further, go ahead and post it down below and we'll take a look at that either in just answers to your comments in another video, or even possibly an entirely new story just based on like your comments and what you're interested in. So without delaying any further, let's go ahead and jump right into our story. Again, this one is called The Harvest. In the pouring rain and dim light of the forest, Derek could see nothing. Still, he knew she was out there. He could smell her, and he knew that she smelled him as well. He grew suddenly aware of the pungent odor of his own fur. His hand firm yet relaxed on his bow, Derek scanned the shadows. His other hand silently knocked an arrow and waited. Pit, pat, 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 pit, pit, pat, pat. The shadows swayed in a lazy, rainy waltz, all except for one. One shadow stood perfectly still, perfectly quiet. Derek's pulse quickened. He drew long breaths, trying to steady himself. Watching the shadowy form, he drew his bow back slowly. Through the mist, two steely eyes stared back. The rain stopped, but neither hunter nor prey seemed to notice. Pfft! Derek loosed the arrow. An angry snarl rang out in retort, followed by the sound of retreat through the underbrush. Knocking another arrow, Derek emerged from his hiding spot and cautiously stepped his way toward the shadow. He moved swiftly, silently gliding over the fallen trees and stumps. There it was, the small white feather on the back of his arrow. His eyes followed the shaft. Into the mud. A miss. Derek sighed. The pounding in his chest subsided. He pulled the arrow from the mud and examined it. The shaft was unbroken, the head undamaged, and with some black-tipped silver hairs. Not a complete miss after all. She's very quick, Derek mused, and big. Several large feline footprints, twice the size of his own hands, dotted the mud. They seemed to come from the north, in the direction of the Hawkwood, and they led in great strides up to the ridge. Taking out a wooden flask of tree spirits and a small leather bag of nuts, Derek took a seat on a nearby log that was covered in a cushion of verdant moss. The hunter who begins the chase wanting will leave it wanting. Being a Hutan himself, Derek knew the old Hutani proverbs well. Although this particular one referred more to preparing for a hunt, Derek's stomach, which had accompanied him on this the third day of his hunt, convinced him to apply the proverb more broadly. The rain had now stopped completely, but the descendants of the downpour remained glistening on broad viridian leaves. The fresh nectar of forest dew surrounded Derek. It filled his nostrils, sank into his hunting robe, and settled on his coarse beard. The songbirds sang in chorus with the tree dragons, as if the rain had never interrupted their treetop symphony. But Derek could not stay and enjoy the serenity of the Zelynwood. The beast had killed 3 of his tribe, Derek's brother and his brother's wife and child. The scene of their slain bodies on the forest floor appeared before him. They never found his brother. Food is life. Life is food. Derek did not dwell on it, nor did he question its simplicity. He ate one more nut, for all creatures must eat, took one more sip of the tree spirits, and, though still hungry, he began the difficult task of tracking a creature who, like all creatures, did not wish to die. Derek moved deftly through the forest. The rain had softened the ground, and the beast he pursued, the sapali, or saber lynx, left very large and very clear footprints in the mud. The tracks were a written language the Hutani knew well. Derek lowered the hood on his robe and knelt down. The long tufts on his ears perked up and twitched subtly. He flared his great nostrils. While his other senses were keeping watch, Derek eyed the tracks in the ground. A sudden leap, then a graceful landing. A mad dash with open claws leading down into deeper forest and safety. Through briar and thicket the path narrowed. As the path narrowed, the tracks grew closer together and steadier. Walking now, to the stream. A couple licks of water, perhaps? A cool breeze blew across the stream and played with the tufts of his ears. The hush of the stream brought a slight smile to Derek's eyes. Of course, this was not the first stream Derek had ever had the pleasure of eavesdropping on, but he enjoyed the murmuring monologue each time as if it were the first. The tracks, unfortunately, did not linger by the stream, but began to climb. Bound to his task, Derek followed them, up and up, until he found himself on a ridgeline overlooking the forest. The deep forested valleys rolled down from either side of the ridge, disappearing into mist and shadow. The paling light of the sun was fading, and it threw a soft blanket of pastels across the Zelynwood. Though incredibly beautiful during the day, with its lush greens and auburn barks, the Zelynwood could be extremely dangerous at night. Looking down into the forest from the ridge, Derek could see nothing but darkness and a twisted maze of brambles and brush. The sun was abandoning him, and moon and stars together could not penetrate the thick canopy of trees that now cast the forest in shade. An uneasiness began to grow in his mind. It spread through his head and seized his nerves. The tracks he had followed had been clear. More accurately, they had been too clear, and the trail too easy to follow. There was very little cover and almost no trees up here on the ridge. Derek was completely exposed. The sapali, smart as she was, would never expose herself so blatantly without a very good reason. It was a trap. With his heart beginning to pound in his head, Derek quickly scanned the valleys, trying to spot the sapali's hideout. He could see nothing. Still, he knew she was out there. Derek did not dare venture into the depths of the forest where his prey was likely already lying in wait. At the same time, it was impossible to stay on the ridge. Exposed as he was, this was sheer suicide, and Derek, like most creatures, did not wish to die. He could run, then be caught in a matter of seconds, and die with the knowledge he had at least made for a more entertaining meal. Just then, he spied a great sprawling oak just a little ways down the ridge into the valley. The oak cast its shadow into the forest, but most of the area around it was clear and lit with moonlight. He took his bow from his back, nocked an arrow, and walked. Closer, 20 meters. Closer, 15. He strained his eyes. Nothing. 10 meters. What was that? 7 meters. Almost. 5. 4. About 3 meters from the tree, Derek sprinted, and, feeling a phantom in pursuit, he leapt, gripping the bark with his claws. He gripped, he pulled, he clawed and scraped until he was safely out of reach of any creature that might try to make a meal of him. Sitting in the crook of the tree, he reached into his hunting robe and removed the flask of tree spirits. After taking a sip, he put it back and, to his surprise, found a large tear in his robe. Phantoms don't have claws. Maybe it was already torn? He debated with himself as he drifted off to sleep in the crook of the weathered oak. A vicious snarl jolted Derek awake. His eyes darted around quickly, his heart pounded. Nothing. He peered more closely. He waited. Stillness all around. Perhaps it was just a dream. He watched the darkness carefully. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Not a single breath. Having lived in the Zelynwood over 3 decades, Derek understood the meaning of this silence. It was the sound of countless creatures trying to remain hidden. They held their breaths and watched and waited for danger to pass. But it didn't pass, for it was waiting too. So the silence continued on through the night, and at times it rang so clearly in Derek's ears that he could not rest. His mind wandered from a state of primal alertness to sleepless delirium, where he heard the screams, and he saw visions of long white teeth and blood upon fallen leaves. More than once he awoke suddenly, eyes scanning the darkness, unsure whether the dampness in his fur was sweat or dew. He couldn't prevent the dreadful scenes of gore and horror that befell his kin from penetrating his clouded mind. He saw the body of his brother's wife. He saw the body of his niece. But he didn't see his brother, for his body was never found. Life is food, and all creatures must eat. The sky slowly brightened to dull gray. The birds cautiously began their morning songs. Maybe she left? Derek descended from the oak as softly as a leaf. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he deftly readied an arrow and scanned the underbrush. Nothing, but not the same nothing that held sway during the night. This nothing was not full of fear, but of the hope of a new day. He lifted his nose in the air, but found only the scent of the reawakening forest flowers. The sapoli had gone. Derek's nerves began to calm. His body resumed its normal functioning and urgently reminded him of the tree spirits he had drunk earlier. Resting his bow against the trunk of a tree, Derek unfastened his hunting robe and proceeded to complete this most important task. As he was finishing, a twig snapped suddenly. The sound echoed through the forest as if it were a canyon. Derek froze. Leaves began to rustle, moving right toward him. Rustle, snap, rustle, closer. Derek drew a knife from his belt. Rustle, rustle, crunch, snap, rustle. Derek leapt out, ready to meet his attacker. A terrified and completely bewildered squirrel darted away, hopped up on the side of a tree, and began to chatter angrily at the hutan who had so boorishly interrupted her morning. With robe flowing open and knife in hand, Derek let out an audible laugh. Despite the danger of the night, or perhaps because of it, he couldn't help but laugh at the ridiculous scene that had followed. Fixing his robe and taking his bow, Derek began looking for signs of the sapoli. He started at the tree where he had spent the night, and worked his way outwards, moving in widening circles. He walked, he crawled, he searched, he sniffed. Yet after half an hour of searching, he was rewarded with only a few rays of warming sunshine, and a gentle breeze that made the leaves dance in the boughs and across the forest floor. Derek sat on a log, took a few sips from the wooden flask of tree spirits, and watched the performance while he considered his next move. As the sweet drink warmed his throat, one leaf in particular caught his attention. A pale yellow leaf, not unlike the others, was moving in a way very much unlike the others. It danced and twirled and tumbled in the opposite direction. Shrin, Derek mused. The shrin danced its way to a spot by a fallen tree, where it swirled the leaves around it and then stopped. Derek walked over. Half hidden beneath the leaves was the partial imprint of a large feline paw. He smiled. It was not a smile, though, that said that everything was fine and wonderful, but rather it said that things could not be worse, and therefore there's nothing left to do but smile. He stroked his coarse beard and scratched behind the tuft of his ear. He knew why the shrin decided to help him. The hunt was to become a harvest. Derek took the tree spirits back out and took a long draught. He closed it, put it back into his robe, and followed the tracks. The trail was difficult to follow, but it led through a part of the deep woods of the Zelynwood that Derek had hunted in before. Here the trees grew tall and wild. Their massive roots branched out beneath them, and their branches rooted themselves in the sky. It was cooler, and there was little underbrush as the trees blocked much of the light from the sun. The Sopley's tracks merged with the game trail, where they were intermixed with the tracks of wild stags, bristleback boar, wolves, uintach and their calves, and all other sorts of creatures. Derek carefully picked his way through the flurry of footprints, tail drags, scat and scrapes. He worked quickly and could almost see the bristlebacks rooting around in the leaves for mushrooms, or a herd of uintach walking quietly single file with the matriarch in front and the spirited calves in the middle, using their stubby horns and tusks to spar. Through these visions, Derek saw another one, a lone, giant cat stepping softly over logs, moving steadily and with great purpose. The wind shifted, and Derek stopped suddenly. He threw his nose into the air and scented the wind. The smell was unmistakable. The stench was unforgivable. The acidic smell of soured, rotting wood could only mean one thing: Baringai. But what are they doing so far from the Zelynwood? Derek crouched behind a tree, where he'd be able to observe the trail, but hopefully not be spotted. His bow remained on his back. His knife remained in his sheath. He dared not even draw them, for the Hutani so revered the sanctity of the hunt that they would not defile their hunting bow or blade with the blood of an enemy. And this was no mere hunt, but a harvest. Striking down an enemy during a harvest would damn Derek, and he would lead a cursed life afterwards. He had one option: to remain hidden and hope the wind did not shift again, for a Baringai's sense of smell was almost as keen as a Hutan's. Behind the fallen tree, Derek watched and waited as the stench grew closer and closer, and soon he could hear it. Straining, creaking footsteps, and a soft, half-whispered language that lacked any access. Just down the game trail, 3 figures came into view. Their bodies were hard and twisted, their wiry, vine-like muscles in constant strain against each other. Each wore full armor, hardwood breastplates with shoulder guards, a series of layered hardwood plates hanging from their waist to just above the knee, arm guards, shin guards, and a cloth headdress that came down to the base of their necks and secured with a dull metal band around the forehead. The band on one of them was decorated with glyphs. An officer. Each Baringai carried a short bladed staff. A hunting party? A patrol? The Baringai did not differentiate between warfare, hunting, or even crushing an insect beneath their feet. To them it was all killing, and it was all very natural. Derek watched them and wished he'd brought his war club, though it was probably better that he didn't. He would already have to purify a spirit of the anger rising in his bones before he could continue the harvest. The Baringai walked closer, but so concentrated on their task were they that they didn't seem to notice Derek. They headed off to the south, murmuring and gesturing to each other. When Derek was certain they had left, he emerged from behind the tree and walked down to the stream to begin the purification ritual. Taking a stone from the stream, he spoke. Falsegadan, ha shelsengren. He dipped the stone into the water 3 times, and then wiped it with his robe. He repeated this menial task with another stone, and then another. Yet as he polished the stones, the anger he felt towards the Baringai did not ease. He still smelled them. He heard their twisted bodies creaking through the Zelynwood, through his homeland, completely unchecked, while he hid in the brush like a rabbit. He recalled defending the Hutani villages against Baringai raids. His brother was with him. He was gone now. Food is life. Life is food. His brother's wife and child, the blood on the leaves. Derek clenched his hand around the stone. Long white teeth, twisted bodies, and he hid in the brush like a rabbit. He stood up suddenly and threw the stone as far as he could. It bounced off a tree and fell into the leaves. It did not move. He sighed heavily and walked away. Some time had passed now. The sun was at its peak and already beginning to fall. The Sopley's trail was growing cold and difficult to follow. Then it disappeared altogether. No tracks, no scent. No sound and no shrin appeared to help Derek find his way. He searched and circled, but found nothing. So he did the only thing that he could. He continued in the direction the tracks had been leading before he lost them. The rest of the day passed quietly as Derek followed the invisible trail. Berengach, he mumbled. The trail was fresh, but now, Fisrungach. He looked at the ground, and though the birds and tree dragons sang sweetly above him, he was lost in his own thoughts and oblivious to the beauty of their song. Ganalresvig, the beast could be back in the Hawkwood by now, or back home. Felganahinreg. His shout echoed through the trees, and the songbirds and tree dragons went silent. For the first time since he'd lost the trail, he looked up. The broad leaves of the Zelynwood still hung over him, and beyond them the night sky was beginning to take shape. Finding a suitable tree, Derek climbed its branches, settled in, and fell asleep, with the shimmer of starlight on his fur and the soft cooing of an owl in his ears. The night was long and restful, and Derek awoke early the next morning, but he did not immediately set out after the Sopley. He decided to have breakfast first, for food is life. He sat near the game trail and waited patiently, cradling his bow as if it were a child. Soon enough, he heard footsteps. A wild stag tiptoed down the trail, stopping every now and then to graze. It continued, unhurried, until it was out of sight. Not long after the stag had passed, a rabbit hopped cautiously into view, coming from the other direction. In one smooth motion, Derek swung the bow up, drew the string, and loosed the arrow, pinning the rabbit to the ground. Derek walked over to it, picked it up, and held it in his hands as it breathed its last. One moment alive, one moment not. And though Derek had watched the transformation in his hands, he could not tell the exact moment when the life left the rabbit. The only fact that mattered now was that it was indeed dead. Derek cooked it over a small fire and enjoyed his first proper meal since beginning the hunt. Having eaten, he continued his trek westward, the direction that the Sopley's tracks had been leading before they disappeared. Though Derek had little hope of finding the beast, he knew he could not give up so easily. The will of the Shrin was the will of the Zelynwood itself. To ignore it would be to separate oneself from the Zelynwood, which few Hutani were willing to do. Derek's task now went far beyond protection, or even vengeance for his brother and his brother's family. It was a matter of life, and it was a matter of death. Derek had been following the phantom trail for nearly 4 hours, when he smelled it. Beringai. He stopped and listened, but heard nothing but a soft whisper in the leaves. The Beringai did not appear to be moving. Derek followed the scent, moving cautiously and keeping both ears and eyes alert. He had no plans of engaging them, but if he could get close enough to their camp, maybe he could find out what they were doing so far west of the Zelynwood. Derek drew closer. Closer. He felt his pulse quicken. Adrenaline shot through his senses, enhancing them to remarkable acuity. The odor grew stronger, fresher, closer, less trees. A clearing? No smoke, no fire. A temporary camp. A place to rest? Closer. Still. No noise. No movement. Sleeping? Dead. 2 Beringai lie strewn across the clearing, their bodies mangled, their faces contorted in agony. One lay face down, his right arm a full meter away. The other's throat was slashed open. The cut was so deep that the head was nearly severed. Derek spotted a thin trail of blood leading away from the clearing into the forest. As he followed it, the trail grew more distinct, and the fate of the victim more grave. This Beringai had suffered the longest, and had only recently died. He had glyphs on his headband. The officer. Derek could not help but feel sorry for this Baringai, for this corrupted servant of the Zelynwood, whom he had just seen the day before. The hatred Derek felt for them, that he could not wash away with water, was now washed away with blood. Scenes of his brother's wife and child returned to him, blood on the leaves, and silence. A strange fact now struck Derek. If his brother and his family had not been killed by the sapling, Derek would not have killed that rabbit, and it would likely still be hopping down the trail at that very moment. The sapling would likely have taken a different path, and the 3 Baringai would also be alive. To question a death or its cause or its purpose was useless. Someday, perhaps, the chain of events set in motion by his killing that rabbit might even lead to his own death. But it didn't matter. Another old Hutani proverb came into Derek's mind. Death is life. Finding a nearby stream, Derek bent over and picked up a stone. Fal sigadan, ha shall singren. He dipped the stone into the water 3 times and wiped it with his robe. He took another stone, a flat, round stone, the color of a stormy sky. A small pearl white stone, almost a perfect sphere. A tan gritty stone with a long crack. Stone by stone, Derek felt his spirit soothe, until finally he set the last stone in the water, letting the stream roll gently over it. He stood up and walked away. Derek returned to the bloodied paw prints he'd found near the body of the Baringai officer. He left the bodies to be claimed by the Zelynwood, and followed the Sopley's trail, deeper into the Zelynwood, and closer to the Hutani homeland. Derek felt more at ease here, though with a growing sense of urgency. It was home, with its sprawling broad-leaved trees, its charming brooks and old stone formations. The Hutani homeland was a place of beauty and life. It was said that there was a tremendous stone city here before the Zelynwood conquered it. Large temples and aqueducts were overgrown now, buried in centuries of dirt and clay. Only fragments of the city's past glory remained, now adorned with a mantle of moss and jeweled with tiny white flowers. This is life. Food is life. Food is life. The Sapali did not eat the Baringai. Admittedly, they probably don't taste very good, but she did not kill them for food, nor did she kill them out of defense, for they seemed to have been caught completely by surprise by the Sapali's attack. A new thought sprouted in Derek's mind. The Sapali was not of the Hawkwood, but of the Zelynwood, like himself. She had felt the presence of the Baringai, the servants of the Zelynwood, in her homeland. This was war. This was extermination. The Zelynwood and Zelynwood had once been one and the same, together known as the Aldenwood. But for some 600 years now, they had been at war with each other, each one striving to outgrow the other. They conquered lands outward, and when they could conquer no more, they fought each other along the river that passed between them. When the trees themselves could advance no further, they sent their spores forth and the fur of the creatures that lived within them. In exchange for their service, the Zelynwood offered nourishment in the form of rich nuts and seeds, fresh leaves, and ever-ripening fruit. Being situated in less advantageous soil, the Zelynwood could not make such a pure offering. Instead, it infected its inhabitants with its own spores, growing in their bodies and in their minds, giving them unnatural strength and abilities. The Baringai were a result of this pact. The Sapali, though, was a creature of the Zelynwood, born in its shade, raised in its depths, and nourished by its spirit. She and Derek were kin. The trees above Derek shaded him. The ground below him steadied his feet. A soft breeze blew on his back and set the leaves whispering. Derek raised his head, and the fragrance of forest flowers drifted into his nose. His eyes widened. There was another scent. He turned quickly. Not more than 20 meters away stood the Sapali, its muscles strong and taut, its eyes clear and piercing, its teeth long and thick. Data quickly knocked an arrow and drew it back as a reflex. She leapt into the brush and disappeared. He lowered the bow, replaced the arrow into his quiver, slung the bow on his back, and drew a small knife from a sheath that was hanging from around his neck. It had a smooth white handle of staghorn, and the polished blade was about the length of a man's hand, and was flawless. This was a harvester knife. It was the only way to harvest a creature's spirit. Derek looked at the blade. Not quite as long as her teeth. Derek turned, harvester knife in hand, and continued walking. It would do no good to try to chase the beast. She was following him now. The two walked through the growing shadows of the trees. Derek turned quickly. Nothing. But the dreadful silence continued to follow him. He walked on, step by step, step, step. Night was coming. Step, step. Derek stared straight ahead. By the smell, the Sopley was close behind. Very close. Step, step. He'd found the Sopley. Step, step. But he was trapped. Step, step. Night was coming. Step, step. The bodies, the blood, the glyphs on the headband. Step. The knife. Step. The teeth. Step, step. Food is life. Step. Death is life. Step. The silence was closing in. Close. Step, step, step. Derek spun quickly to meet the pouncing Sopley. The knife went up, the teeth came down, and the pair fell to the forest floor and did not move. The world was cast in shadow and light, a vast plain. The pale grasses blew in the seething wind. Above them, the immeasurable sky hung in pieces, cracked by lightning and by the faults of men. From the clouds, starlight fell to the ground like rain, then flowed in rivers to the sea. They walked. A single bison stood in the distance and watched them. They walked towards it, and although it had stood on the horizon, they now stood before it in what seemed like only seconds, though they had but walked the distance. The bison stood tall, its horns broad and the length of a man. Its fur was thick and full. The rings of its eyes glowed cold with starlight. The bison turned its massive head to them and sniffed each one carefully. After a moment, it snorted and walked away. Derek and the Sopley walked on until they reached the sea. But there were no waves. It sat perfectly still, perfectly silent. The Sopley looked at Derek. Derek returned her gaze until she turned and leapt into the water. After a short swim, the Sopley emerged again, shimmering with the light of 1,000 stars. With great speed she ran off, leaving Derek alone on the shore of the Sea of Stars. He looked up. The sky began to tilt and spin, and then all he saw was darkness. Derek awoke to the cooing of an owl. The night dew was already settling on his fur. Feeling a searing pain in his arm, he looked to his right. His arm lay clamped in the Sopley's jaws. Derek carefully freed it and bandaged it. He made a sledge out of some branches and, with great difficulty, dragged her body onto it and secured it with some vines. He then took the wooden flask of tree spirits from his robe, emptied it, and began the journey home. Istoran fen. So that is the end of the harvest. Thank you again so much for joining me on this journey. It really makes the difference. I hope you enjoyed this one. I know it had a different feel than the first story. The next story will also have a different feel from the first two. But we're exploring different aspects of this fantasy world. That being said, if you missed the first story, if you missed The Waker of Waves, I'll put the link to that video at the end of this video, as well as a link to the commentary on it. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or would just like to explore something specific in this fantasy world, let me know, either in the comments down below, or you can message me on social media. Links are in the description, and we will explore that together. Okay, and in 1 week, I will post another video that will be commentary on this story, commentary on the harvest. So get those questions in, those comments in, and we'll talk about them in 1 week. So finally, of course, I want to thank all of my supporters for all of your questions, your comments, and especially my Patreon supporters. You guys are really making the difference here, and I greatly, greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to become one of them, I'll put the link to my Patreon page down below. There are benefits to becoming a patron, but you guys can look that up on your own. There is also some free content on my Patreon page, additional content, some like drawings, some maps, and some like short essays and stuff. So feel free to go ahead and check those out. Even if you don't want to be a patron, that's perfectly fine. This content is for you. Okay, so go ahead and enjoy it, and I will see you guys back here next week for the commentary on the harvest. Thank you again, and as always, take care.